So, I think we're all ready to go. I'm looking for a thumbs up from the back, yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to the Festival of Politics at the Scottish Parliament. I'm Claire Adamson, I'm the MSP for Motherwell and Wishaw, and I convene the Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee of the Scottish Parliament. So I'm delighted to be doing our event today on How Safe is Europe, with a fantastic panel who I'm just going to introduce now, and I'll go from left to right. So on my left here is Dr. Benjamin Martel, who's a Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at the University of Edinburgh and Associate Director of the Europa Institute. Next to him, Robert. I think I've seen more of Robert than his wife has this week. This is our third panel in the festival. So he's a partner at the Brunswick Group, a critical issues advisory firm in Washington, DC, and he's a management consultant and communications strategist and futurist and writer, and his novel Lincoln 2.0 explores a near future of AI candidates, which sounds interesting. And next to him is Professor Richard Rose, the founder director of the Centre for Study of Public Policy at the University of Strathclyde, and is internationally known for his books about the important issues of public policy in Europe, the United States and further afield. And his recently published book was European Security from Ukraine to Washington. And last but not least, and I'm sorry I don't have a full bio, but Dr. Luba Satsapina is from Liverpool, John Muir University, where she lectures on international relations and politics, and her previous work has included global security, gender issues and strategic studies. So the format is we'll have a little setting of the scene from each of the panellists. I'll ask a couple of questions and then we'll open to the audience. There are roving mics, so if you do get asked to chosen to take a question, if you wait for the mic, and everyone will be able to hear and do that. So I think we'll start in reverse order, if you don't mind, and I'll ask Luba to start for us.
No pressure. Thanks very much, Claire. Thanks very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here. Okay, to set the scene. I'm going to start by answering the key question that this event is centered around is how likely is the World War III in Europe, right? So I would say it isn't likely at the moment. However, this peace, this relative peace that we currently have, we shouldn't take it for granted. So the war in Ukraine has shown us that war has returned to the continent. And currently we're looking at the development of new technologies that change the nature of warfare. Also in terms of how safe is Europe. Forgive me please for being dull, but what do we actually mean by safe? If we're talking about safe as in there are no bombs falling on our heads at the moment, yes, okay, we're safe. But I think in terms of the transition from the 1940, like V-Day, 1945, safe now is seen as something different. Like, are we safe with the ongoing climate emergency that needs to be addressed? Are we safe with the global pandemics? Are we safe with the lack of resources? Are we safe with the growing poverty and food insecurity around the world? Are we actually safe? So I would begin by kind of inviting the audience by thinking about what do we actually mean by safe. And to turn to the geopolitical issues, yeah, the war has returned to Europe. The nature of war has changed. We have to address it as European states, also as an academic community. And also, I think, and perhaps I'll talk about this a bit more later, but we shouldn't just think about deliberate war. Perhaps that is not likely at the moment. I'm talking about the war between, say, NATO and Russia. However, what we should pay attention to is inadvertent escalation and the war that wasn't meant to happen, considering the type of technologies that we have on the battlefield and in the war rooms today. So I'll just leave it here, and I'm happy to expand later. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Richard, would you?
Yes. I published a book in January, which I wanted to call From the Black Sea, from the Bosphorus or the Black Sea to the Potomac. And the London publisher said, Americans don't know where the Bosphorus or the Black Sea is, and Europeans don't realize that on the Potomac, the CIA and the Pentagon are on the south side of the river, and the White House is on the other side of the river. There's also very much a focus on the Europe in the title refers to what might be called flyover country, because the immediate challenge to European security is in the too near abroad. It's in Ukraine, which doesn't want to surrender territory that it now holds and would like the war to stop, and is technically, in Brussels terms, in the near abroad, and in Neville Chamberlain's terms, is a country we've never heard about. And the other non-European country is, of course, Washington. Chapter 7 is called America Tilts Toward the Pacific, which is an Obama phrase from almost 20 years ago. And if you look at the population distribution, which is tilted to the West Coast and toward Latin America, this is Texas, Florida, to California, you can see that Europe is a long way away. The book ends with 2 points, immediate. The first of it is, given that Trump has made Article 5 unreliable, and that the French rejection of German rearmament to European defense community in 1954 means that there's no European institution that could command a European army. To what extent and at what tempo can the political structure be created to make a mass of Germany, France, of the people in the room with, what's his name, Trump last Monday? Because anyone briefing Trump would say, just because they're coordinated to be here, they came in separate planes and they'll leave in separate planes. So you can't rely on them producing anything either. So I'll stop there.
Okay. John, please. Robert, sorry.
Yeah. So safety, I think my first answer is that, as the professor noted, there are significant new weapons technologies that could create a situation in which no one state actor wanted to go to war, but they kind of just cascade into it. And so we could talk about those, but it's not just drone technologies and things like that. A lot of it's cyber, and a cyber war, we would just wake up one morning and our electronics wouldn't work and we would wonder what happened, and so would everyone else. And so I do worry about things spiraling out of control, not just here, but you mentioned the Pacific. I think most American policymakers are very focused on China and the Pacific, where things spiral out of control, and all of a sudden, some of these technologies are sort of first mover advantage, and the second mover is really disadvantaged, and so you have the potential for these things to spin out of control very quickly, which is why I think the Trump administration is desperate to wind down the war in Ukraine so they can pivot most of their focus to Asia. And also they're worried about things spiraling out of control. So I think there's that. I think bigger picture, I think it's hard to imagine a future where the US isn't still a critical member of NATO, and because there's just a number of reasons why the United States and the NATO countries are linked, and I just don't think any one administration is going to find a way to de-link those. And I think, in fact, the administration right now is relearning the value of NATO and sort of relearning the importance of just the facts on the ground. And the facts on the ground are pushing them towards their allies.
Thank you. And Benjamin.
Super. Okay, thanks so much. So I think maybe I'll start by thinking about some of the more optimistic things that came out of the European response to Russia's full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and then think about maybe some of the limitations. I mean, I think if you listen to the kind of high-level rhetoric coming from European capitals, and you think that quite a lot has been changing, and actually on the ground, there are many kind of very significant changes that have taken place in the European security landscape over the past few years, right? We've seen increasing cooperation between the EU and NATO, a reduction in the differential between which countries were in each of those. We've seen very high levels of cohesion between the European and the EU member states and the various countries, and also very high levels of political consensus on security and defence issues. You've seen a host of kind of EU and non-EU initiatives aimed at mobilising and translating some of Europe's wealth into offensive military capabilities that can be sent to Ukraine. And all of this takes place within this kind of broader rhetoric, which you may have come across, of kind of strategic autonomy, right? Which is the EU has been talking about strategic autonomy for a long time. It doesn't quite know what strategic autonomy means, but in a sense, it's this effort of trying to get away from the long-standing dependence on the United States, which Richard was talking about ever since the 1950s. I think if you look behind this, you start to see that there's some really, really significant challenges, right? That all of these, all of these moves, all of these developments, all of these new structures, they're very important, they're very slow, they're very cumbersome, and they don't seem to fit the time frame at which the international order seems to be spiraling out of control, not just what with Putin's doing, but also with the return of Trump, right? And so Europe fundamentally doesn't have the ability to marshal the same kind of military resources on a long term from its economic base than other countries do. Russia's able to produce military equipment much more cheaply. Europe seems to me that in terms of the societal understanding, and I think this is of course a very positive thing, not prepared for a long-scale conflict. This is something that Putin readily weaponizes, right? If you see, turning off the gas and knowing that that's going to increase populist representation in these countries. The European Union, as it's set up, is very vulnerable to spoilers, right? It's very easy for individuals like Viktor Orban to say, well, we're going to delay the sanctions package because we want to link it to this other issue. The very fact that these issues are being linked together tells you just how serious some of these member states are about security. So, and all of this is taking place against the backdrop of what Richard alluded to earlier, which is that this complex security architecture where you have the European Union as a security actor in some respects, as a very coherent economic actor, but a very, very minimal, low-level kind of strategic defense actor, where NATO has problems of its own and questions about capabilities and credibility, and issues with, of course, the Trump administration, but also remains the main defense provider within Europe. So there's a long way to go until the European Union or Europe as a whole is on a war footing, and of course that's probably not a situation where any of us want to end up anyway. So those are some big questions, I think.
Thank you. So I was representing the Parliament with the presiding officer at the Nordic Council just a few short months after the invasion of Ukraine, and it was absolutely, an intense experience, much more than I was expecting when I agreed to go. Obviously, things had changed, but we saw a big leap from Finland and Sweden towards NATO, towards that further integration, and that happened almost immediately. What difference has that made, and has that pace of feeling that they had to all come together slowed? And what are the barriers now? Is it the individual countries' spend? Is it, as we say, leadership and what would be a European force? How is that all panning out at the moment? And I'll maybe go again to Robert first, and then get the others' perspectives.
I mean, so I obviously come at this from an American perspective, but I remain an optimist about this in the sense that during the Cold War, the United States and European allies, all democracies, but very different political systems, very different political cultures, very different economic systems, were able to rally and defend themselves collectively. And we were successful, and we won. And I think we can do that again. I think there are a lot of challenges. You mentioned the Russian gas trap, basically, as one of them. And there's always challenges with different democracies, you know, depending on who wins what election, how we work together. But I keep coming back to democracies have historically had a hard time with collective security, going back to the Greeks, but yet we don't have a choice. So if we don't have a choice, then we have to make it work, and we've made it work one time before, and that threat was even greater because the Warsaw Pact was far, far more significant than the threat we face now. So I'm an optimist only because we've done it once before, and I think we can make it work again, irrespective of who is in what capital at the moment, winning what election. So.
Okay, Richard, sorry, do you want to come in on?
I think the strongest point where there is preparation is what's called the Joint Expeditionary Force in the Baltic, which includes upwards of half a dozen countries: Poland, the 3 Baltic states, Finland, Sweden. The Hansestadt, the North German cities on the Baltic. Berlin is not quite on the Baltic. So there is, even though there are long borders in Finland, Moscow might think twice before engaging across a long border. The Swedes and the Finns and the Swedes are the most advanced and have delivered the most thoughts to the Poles. The really tricky question, if I were sitting in the Kremlin, not for enjoying the Byzantine in the Byzantine politics rather than the architecture, I would say, would the West fight for Narva? Narva is on the border of Estonia. It's the equivalent of Sudetenland. It's just a little bit, but it's 90% Russian, and its only significance is politics. And that's where I would be sweating.
Okay. Luba?
Yeah, I appreciate Ben kind of being optimistic about it. It's good to balance it out because you'll see, I'm really all doom and gloom. Now the unity, just to kind of go back to what you, Claire, mentioned about how durable it is. I think that there's a lot of fatigue now within European countries as well. It's very noticeable. It's kind of quiets down, and then again there's a new meeting, again new discussions. But to me it seems like a lot of this unity does not actually produce tangible results that help Ukraine win. Ultimately, we can't escape the US, right? Europe, it just seems to me that there's a lot of movement, a lot of discussions, and they're fantastic, it's great. And indeed, you know, we had Sweden and Finland join NATO. That's historic, that's huge. And very much, I would say, just by analyzing kind of the Kremlin rhetoric or the Kremlin discourse, the discourse in the Kremlin, that was expected. It wasn't a huge surprise to them, and that's not seen as, at least from what I can see, it wasn't a shock that completely ruined all Putin's plans, right? I would assume he expected that. But my point is, the US is still a key actor, and I know we'll talk about this probably in greater detail, but even Zelensky, you know, yes, European states provide a lot of aid to Ukraine, but ultimately he is focused on securing more of the US aid. Absolutely, Europe does not really have, as Ben mentioned, it's an economic actor, but in terms of security and defense, it will not be able to defeat Russia alone. And I would say also it's important to focus on, we're not just talking about, you know, armed conflict, right? We're not just talking about, I'm not even going to go into the nuclear zone yet, but let's say we're not talking about conventional war yet. Russia uses all sorts of tactics, information warfare, cyber warfare, and it's difficult for Europe to deal with Russia alone. And from another point, I would also say, just from my observations, Russia does not really consider Europe as a serious actor. That unity, perhaps, I wouldn't say, it's annoying, it's irritating for Putin, right? And perhaps there was an expectation that Ukraine will be dropped sooner, like that it wouldn't drag for as long as it dragged. However, just kind of, and again, like, obviously we don't have access, we don't know exactly what's going on. That's just some observations and some conversations that I've been a part of, and it doesn't seem like Russia is that concerned about Europe. US is the key concern. So everything kind of just brings back to it. So I would just say the unity, yes, is great. How much does it actually do?
Benjamin, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks. So just a few points on unity. I mean, so among mainstream parties and leaders that were, as I call it, kind of present at the invasion, levels of unity have been reasonably high, right? I mean, and a lot of these leaders, when the shock of the invasion happened, they called in their coalition partners, or they called in the opposition, said, look, what do we need to do to maintain unity on this issue? And so those within countries in Europe, you had those kind of coalitions being built about this is what we need to do strategically. Across Europe as a whole, you had those conversations in the Foreign Affairs Council, right? So you have that unity among those kind of parties. Some of them were populist, but really the populist leaders were in countries like Poland and the UK, where you actually have a very strong sort of antagonistic relationship with Russia anyway. So they were always kind of on board. I think it's been really, really hard to maintain that unity, right? And I think part of the problem actually goes back to, Robert made an excellent point earlier about the relationship between democracy. And I think when we look at democracies, there are some ways in which they're very, very well equipped to mobilize resources, right? I mean, you think about this argument about Reagan overheating the Cold War and essentially ending the Cold War because the Soviets couldn't outproduce the United States. I mean, that's an advantage of a free market democracy. At the same time, they had the vulnerabilities at times of war. And I guess one of those is if you want to empathize for a second with Putin, I invite you to empathize with Putin. What does he do? What does he do to win in Ukraine? He drags out the conflict as much as possible. He raises the cost as much as possible for those involved. He can afford to do this. He's an authoritarian leader. He can brutalize his citizens and jail them, and it doesn't matter, right? He doesn't get that blowback sufficient to dethrone him. And if that happens, then the leader that comes in is even more radical anyway. What do we then do in Western Europe in response to that in a war that we don't necessarily conceive of as an existential threat? Now, I'd imagine that unity will be very, very easy to maintain in the Baltics, right? If you're right on the border and you fear that this is an existential threat because you're next. But then I invite you to think, what would the conversation be like in Dublin, right? Are you going to care in Dublin much more about the housing crisis, or are you going to care much more about ensuring that you're spending more money supporting Ukraine? Same in Portugal. I'm not picking on Dublin. I could say the same for Scotland as well, right? So I think we have to ask ourselves how much are we willing to put into victory, because this is exactly the game that Putin is inviting us to play.
So in terms of, we all want peace in the near future if possible. What does the recent history tell us about that situation? There was a press conference from the White House setting the record straight in Trump's view of what the recent history has been in that, we didn't deal with Russian incursions into other areas in the near past. But also the fact that I guess one of the things that might sway the Ukrainian leadership and Zelensky is a promise of support and a promise of that security. But we've also broken that in terms of the promise that was given when they gave up their nuclear weapons. So how difficult is this, given the recent history, to get over the line in terms of peace? And I'll go to Richard first for this one.
I think two things have shifted. One thing that shifted, when the Ukraine war started out, there was Western sympathy for obvious reasons. But secondly, it was quite clear that Ukraine was fighting a proxy war. And in a sense, with all apologies to Ukrainians present, this convenient and desirable in equal portions. One of the shifts that's come forward is to talk about NATO rearmament reaching 3.5%. And this is building up the supply of military weapons to replace what was emptied out of the cupboard to send Ukraine, which is a way of saying that talking about we need Ukraine to keep the proxy war going by all means, because this is the here and now war. By the time Germany gets rearmed, or Britain hits its target in 2035, after Starmer hits his growth target, it will be a wee bit late. And the problem here, to challenge what Robert says, I've done research on 2 points. Across Europe, 8 countries, including Germany, the relevant countries, Poland, and Sweden. How much risk do you think is to your security from the global economy, climate change, and military action? And all 3 can legitimately not only be seen as risks, but as claims on the budget, looked at from the point of view of the Chancellor, Minister of Finance. Now, what was interesting was majorities saw all 3 as a fair or a big risk. And this was 10 months after the war in Ukraine, but that 3 years ago, the global economy was 80%, and Britain and Germany were similar to that. Climate change was 70%, which surprised me. The green activists have succeeded. There is no equivalent military activists talking up, and that the leaders, certainly in the British case, if you had a politically competent prime minister, would have to be explaining that we can no longer, we've still got a problem. We, meaning British, and Britain needs to keep the proxy war is going not as well as we would like, for reasons having to do with our talks with Washington. Don't play as well in Washington as they do in London. And secondly, that the budget that Rachel Reeves will have in November will require cuts, not more expenditure. So I see the problems of getting political commitment to spend resources to maintain defense, however defined, and I would define it as shipping weapons. If the Germans can produce them faster to ship to Ukraine than to Germany.
Okay. Libby, you mentioned the other threats other than conflict, obviously climate change. So do you want to reflect a wee bit more on what you think the challenges are in balancing these issues for Western democracies?
Well, let's just put it this way, the climate emergency, for example, is not high up on anyone's agenda at the moment. It is for the civil society actors, for sure, but not for the European states, not for Russia, China, etc. I think at the moment we could define the current kind of state of affairs as rearm Europe, right? There's a lot of talks about rearming Europe. So when there are a lot of talks about this rearmament, I feel that those other threats cannot really be adequately addressed because there's just no resources, no time, just to put it simply, people have no capacity to look into these things. Now, we can debate, ultimately, if we start weighing one threat against the other, what's more imminent, what's more deadly. I mean, I think this is a very complex and long discussion, yeah. But at the moment, the war in Ukraine defines defines this threat environment. Yeah, Russia is a threat. It's the imminent threat to Europe, to most European states, to the US. It's everybody states that Russia is an enemy, and there is a growing concern. And I would say that there's, of course, a concern about Russian nukes, which again, we can talk about. I don't want to go into that zone because that's my zone. But I would begin by focusing on deterring Russia's cyber and information threat, because once that hits, that could be extremely damaging for Europe. So that should be addressed. So while there is a unity in Europe, the defense budgets are supposedly, supposed to increase to 5%, yeah. But there needs to be a strategy, a coherent strategy, and at the moment I'm not seeing it. I mean, there's a strategy, there's some kind of strategy in the UK, some kind of strategy in France, there's an interesting strategy in Romania, but there needs to be a coherent one. The Baltics, indeed, they do have, and Poland, they have a coherent strategy, but how can Europe defend itself against this information and hybrid threat, and cyber threat? That's an important question. So perhaps, if we talk about addressing threats, that's the one that needs to be addressed. By no means I'm diminishing climate emergency. I actually think we should drop the wars and focus on that, right? But what do I know? But ultimately, the hybrid threat coming from Russia, rearming, and nukes can be addressed later, because I don't believe there's an imminent danger of Russia using nukes anytime soon.
So I'm leaving Robert as the person from across the pond last in this question, but Benjamin, do you want to come in on it?
I'm coming on a few points. I mean, I think on the history thing, that the interesting thing there to me is, there's no one clear kind of historical narrative, right? And obviously, Putin has his own narrative. Sometimes it is rooted in history and about what happens if quote unquote great powers are held down or not treated with the respect they deserve. The other line from Putin is actually more future looking. It's kind of transformative, right? We live in a multiplex global order which isn't characterized by Cold War style dynamics, but is rather each power, each region has their own legitimate sort of sphere of influence, and the problem is that the West has run roughshod over that. I think what's interesting is there's a kind of Cold War framing here, and I generally reject the kind of new Cold War idea, because I think it tells us some interesting things, but I think it misses a lot of the kind of important technological change that's taken place, and that shapes things in very important ways. But what's really interesting is, as of next year, we will have lived as long in the kind of post-Cold War order than we will have done in the post-Cold War order. If you think that kind of interregnum lasted roughly from 1990 until maybe 2008, when we saw the war in the invasion of Georgia and the real kind of blowback against what was seen as presumed American imperial largesse after the Iraq War. I mean, so history here clearly plays a really important role. The other thing that plays a role, and I'm by no means an expert on this, but you can see it everywhere, is the mobilization of history and myths and narratives, right? And you get this on both sides. So I spoke about the way that Putin sees things and understands his kind of philosophy of history. I guess in the West, we tend to see this through a kind of, in Western Europe in particular, maybe especially in Britain, through a kind of Munich analogy, right? There's this framing of what is the lesson from history of we thought that Hitler could be mollified, and it turned out that tragically Hitler could not be mollified, and so what is the lesson that you take from that is essentially what European leaders are trying to do, and what they didn't do in 2014 is when the Crimea was invaded, is stepping up and saying, right, we think this is the line that you've crossed, where we now think that your aims are non-limited, right? We don't think it's just about Ukraine, which is why countries like Poland see it as an existential crisis. And of course, Zelensky is very, very good also at mobilizing these selective historical narratives. So if you see, do you remember when in 2022 Zelensky was invited to address almost every parliament within Europe, and he would rock up and he would say, looking very martial, in his green shirt, and say, I'm going to speak to you about the most important historical memory of war you have, and tell you that we, Ukraine, are the victims in exactly the same way. So he used the Munich analogy when he came here, and then when he went to the US, he would talk about independence from the British, right? And so deploying all these different historical narratives, and make of that what you will, right? We know there's a politics of history.
Robert.
Great. So I think for me, at least as an analyst, I have a number of open questions. The first open question I have is the degree to which, before the invasion happened, the degree to which the Western powers thought of Ukraine as a tripwire or not, right? And I think that most American administrations have debated, in the past at least, debated if Ukraine was a tripwire or not. And Obama famously was asking questions about this, right? So that's one question I have. The second question I have connects with the idea, I think in the United States we'll call it like gray zone conflict, but I think do you also refer to it here as hybrid? Is that the same? Yeah, which is that the Russians will use and other states will use things that are short of war or like war, but not, right? So cyber, information war, all sorts of other things that are not quite war as we would conceptualize it, but still war. And so my second big open question is, to what extent will those be utilized, and is there a tripwire point where they start to bleed into, a much more sort of hot war? And then my third very big open question is, if this is a war of attrition, you talked about it being a proxy war, if it's a war of attrition, then how does that war of attrition end, right? And so I guess it seems like there are countervailing points of view on a war of attrition. On one hand, on a war of attrition, the Russians have a finite number of men of fighting age, and a finite pain threshold, theoretically. On the other hand, it's hard to rally Western democracies. Flip it around, Europe alone has a much larger GDP than Russia and could theoretically just ratchet up weapons production of some variety along with the United States for a war of attrition. So I just feel like that war of attrition question is a very big one. I don't know what the current monthly stats on Russian casualties are. They used to be around 30,000 a month. I don't know where they are now. Mathematically, I don't know what pain level they can take for how long. And mathematically, I don't know what amount of weaponry we can provide for how long and its lethality. So I think those are my three big open questions. I would love to hear other people's thoughts on those three, but those are the three I come back to. And in preparation for this, the three big questions that I kept coming back to over and over again, for which I did not have clear answers.
Just an observation from what happened at the time, and people thought it would be a very quick war. It would be over in a matter of weeks, if not months. But Professor Phillips O'Brien, I remember from St Andrews University, was almost a lone voice saying the Ukrainian will dig in because they can't politically be seen to be giving anything away. And he proved to be right in that. But it was just that everyone seems to have an opinion about how long it would last, what the issues would be and everything, and so many of those have been turned out to be wrong, including, President Trump, who was going to fix it in his first week of re-election. So on that point, I'm going to open to the audience, so I'm looking for hands to be in the air, and I see a lady at the back here.
While we're waiting to do that, your point is interesting. I think about the wars in human history that we thought were going to be quick, that turned out to be awful. Americans thought the American Civil War was going to be fast. Europeans, I think, thought World War I was going to be fast. Those were horrific. So, yeah.
Okay, this is a statement or question directed towards you, Luba. The title of the discussion is "How safe is Europe?" Not how worried is Putin about Europe. Yes, the US is crucial to the debate, but I therefore going back to the question, how safe is Europe? Is Trump's sympathy actually with Europe or with Russia? And therefore, I ask, on what basis do you determine, as you said at the beginning, that we aren't on the brink of World War III?
Yeah. you want me to
you
just,
should, sure.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Now, with regards to Trump, I'm going to be upfront. I have no idea who he's with. It seems like one week he is very much with Europe and Ukraine. The next week he is all buddied up with Putin. Honestly, I have no idea what's going on and what he's trying to achieve. I can see that perhaps he's trying to come across as a peacemaker and to have that deal somehow. Now, how that's going to work, I don't know in terms of, like, sorry, don't want to sway away from your question. How safe is Europe? I would say at the moment, I do not see an imminent conflict in Europe. I do not see the war spilling out of Ukraine deliberately. I do not see Putin going further, you know, like some people talk about it.
I'm not talking about Putin, I'm talking about the US. How safe is Europe because of the US?
Oh, you mean that the US can protect?
Is Trump on Russia's side or Europe's side, and therefore, how safe is Europe as a consequence?
I couldn't possibly answer that. I don't know whose
He's a
side
Trump
he's on.
person. Trump first lasted always. So Moscow, Europe, however Europe is defined at the moment, the specific thing is that even if you were prepared to follow the US Constitution without stretching it indefinitely, he would have very substantial powers. His war powers, foreign policy, a lot of which is statements, and we're not accustomed, and secretaries of state aren't accustomed to national security, to finding them on Twitter. I think the key thing is, first of all, assume Trump is pro-Trump, rather than pro-Peter Mandelson or something, or pro-Starmer. This is rubbish, to use a polite word. The key thing is, he is unreliable. And when you go back to Article 5 and Chapter 3, the President of the United States crafted very carefully with the leading senator who was a Republican, Vandenberg. And Article 5 was meant to be a bit vague on paper, because Article 5, as Truman knew as a former senator, could not commit in law the U.S. to defend Greece or Turkey. On the other hand, it's a political decision, and Truman, by sending troops to Korea, and Attlee and the Turks, by sending troops to Korea, showed they wanted to be included too. And so there was total political reliability. And as long as, if you like the Trump administration to include the heir of J.D. Vance, and as LBJ said, there's a 1 in 8 chance of the vice president succeeding. I'll never be elected president. That's why I'm working under Kennedy. And Kennedy made him vice president to win the White House. So, but the key thing is, America is going to be unreliable until for a wee while. And after, in fact, Macron's gone, this is the second problem, the unreliability. We haven't discussed, but I have an office in Berlin, which I go to often. But with the Germans, it's a cultural, psychological thing. The Germans, of my generation, are very pro-democracy, but they get very nervous about talking about weapons and military. And their answer to their national identity is, we are Europeans. And van der Leyen, a former Minister of Defense, has put 2 former Soviet citizens in key positions, one Vice President for National Security, and the other she created the Commissioner for Defense, a Lithuanian and an Estonian. So right at the top. But in fact, the European Commission and the European Council have no authority to coordinate an army. So that you've got unreliable, you have a particularly unreliable US White House, which would rationally stimulate European coordination. And in fact, at the morning seminar I was on, which was an interesting account of how politically incompetent Starmer is by Steve Richards, was Starmer is for a reset in Europe, but he doesn't think about this being military or costing money.
I was just going to say, I would like to share your optimism about there might be change in a few years with the electoral cycle in the US, but I know that Mr. Trump's making noises. He wants to stand again, which of course would take a difference. But have you got a view on that, Robert?
No, that's not going to happen.
It's not going to. Is that a promise?
It's a promise. I've already bet $100 and 2 shots of whiskey on it at a different panel. It's a promise. I do think that the presidents are constrained by reality on the ground, so they may have a bunch of campaign rhetoric, but then the facts are hard and pushes them. So you can see that, the president said on the campaign trail that, and I think he believed that he would be able to quickly end the war in Ukraine. That has not happened, and the facts on the ground are pushing him pretty quickly towards a sort of Biden-light strategy, because the reality is just the reality on the ground forces political leaders to make their decisions, and it constrains what they can do. And I think the same is true with U.S. and NATO. It's in the U.S.'s best interests. NATO is heavily in the U.S. best interest, and so I think the facts will just push the administration towards that behavior, and it's hard to imagine otherwise. I do think that the administration desperately would like to find a way to wind down the war in Ukraine, because they want to your point, they want to pivot to Asia. All of his undersecretaries and appointees on the defense side have talked about this and wanting to strengthen America's posture relative to China in Asia. And so they view this as Ukraine as a challenge in that regard, because they want to more forcefully pivot towards Asia.
Thank you. Benjamin, do you want to comment?
Yeah, so maybe I'll begin with a very quick anecdote, which is a colleague of mine, when Trump was first elected in 2016, and then for his first term, took out a big folder and said, labeled it the Trump doctrine. It was like, we're finally going to understand what Trump does. A week later, threw it in the bin, because it just made no sense to try and predict what Trump was going to do. Now, the lesson from this is not necessarily that it's a kind of fool's errand to analyze the Trump presidency. I think it's difficult. I think the generous way, if you wanted to be generous to Mr. Trump, and I don't know why you would, but if you wanted to, and this is the thinking in some aspects, some parts of the US Academy, is that it's this kind of madman doctrine, right? Which is that what Trump is trying to do is to enhance his credibility by making it seem to external audiences that he's willing to do the unthinkable. And this has a very, very long pedigree in thinking about national security, right? This is the difference during the Cold War between Democratic and Republican administrations, because the Republicans were fiscal conservatives. They didn't want to overheat the economy. They didn't want to spend too much on defense, so they spent less on defense, and they spent more saying to the other side, we might nuke you at any time, right? So it doesn't matter how many nukes we've got. What matters is that we're far more unpredictable. So you can suggest, and it's brinksmanship, and it's dangerous, and it's irresponsible. And it might not even be true, right? But my point is that there's a longer-term pedigree of that kind of thinking in U.S. foreign policy circles, and it may be that this is what Trump is trying to do. It may be that Trump thinks he's a Nixon, and he's not at that level, but he's trying to do it nonetheless, which might be even more dangerous. The more cynical way of thinking about Trump, which is the one I tend to lean to, is that he will do anything for himself and the MAGA movement, and if that involves selling out aspects of the national interest, not wholesale, right? Because then you're right, it can come back to bite you through domestic politics as well. But that he would be willing to sell out and elements of U.S. foreign policy that until he came along had been treated as a certainty, right? Or aspects of the U.S. economy that no president was willing to roll back on, that he's perfectly willing to make these decisions if it improves his base or if it looks really good on TV, right? Having Zelensky there and berating him in a room. So I think there's a semblance of strategy, but it comes with consequences and it's risky, but there's a lot of performativity in domestic politics here as well.
Okay, I'm looking for further questions. Yeah, I've chat right at the back, and then I'll come to you next.
So thank you for coming today to talk to us. So despite microchips being a key component in weaponry, intelligence, and whatever is needed for defense, and the fact that the machine who manufactures the microchips themselves are produced in the Netherlands, Europe doesn't have a microchip industry. So how much of a risk is it for Europe not to have this and to depend on other countries?
Interesting
Can
question.
you repeat the question, please?
Oh, yeah, you can hear. So it's about Europe's economic position in terms of microchip production, because we don't have production here. But obviously, going forward, weapons, everything else are dependent on that, and we're now having to source microchips from outside the European Union. Does that sum it up okay for you, sir? Thank you very much. Luba, do you want to have some thoughts
Sorry,
on
I
that?
didn't quite hear the question.
So, sorry, is my microphone working? Yeah, just now. Right, okay. It's about the risk Europe faces from not having vital resources within Europe, like microchip production, in particular, given the way that weapons and also the whole of the economy is going, and how that exposes Europe to external influence on these areas. So do you want to go first?
I think Robert should go first. He's, I think so too. No, the only comment I would make is there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is the Ukrainians have found a way to exploit aspects of a changing technology to change the way wars are fought. And on the other hand, the Russians have both the scale and the intelligent people. I mean, going into physics was safe under Stalin, safer than biology. That's, and the Chinese, so there's bad news as well. And Robert can spell that.
So it's the question's a really good one. So for the audience, the question is really about advanced microchips and those chips' ability to process information very rapidly, and their use in defense, both in terms of AI, in terms of cybersecurity, and also for weapon systems, mostly guidance systems is I think what you're referencing. So I think the bad news for Europe, as you said, is there's not as much domestic sourcing, but domestic production here. That's right. That means that you don't have as much resilience in terms of supply. The good news is that across the West, there is more resilient supply. The bad news is a lot of the really advanced chips are in Taiwan, which the Americans are very concerned about. The good news is we have time to develop our own production, and sort of the Biden administration was very focused on this within the U.S. context. I suspect that Europeans will be very focused on this in the near term and do something, if they haven't already, something like what the Biden administration was looking at. But you're right, some of the adversaries of the West have very advanced capabilities as well. And I think there's, to extend your question a bit, there's also the issue of quantum computing. So quantum computing, nation states want quantum computing because it's a code cracker. That's kind of the only reason nation states want quantum computing, because it would take a very short amount of time to crack encryption with quantum, whereas with regular computing, it takes a very long time to crack encryption. And there's a theory that the first nation state to really get advanced quantum then is able to sort of decrypt communications that they've stolen over time, and that gives them a big short-term advantage called Q-Day. Q-Day is the day that we will not know, but the day that one team or another gets quantum at an advanced level and can crack all the stuff that they have used espionage to take. What do they do on that day? So that's a very big question. So I think the answer is both chips, processors, but also quantum computing. And there's obviously a race for that as well. And then there's a similar AI race. And there's quite a bit you could read. AI 2027 is a great scenario of that, where the world powers are all trying to figure out how to get something that's the equivalent of AGI that can help them in their mostly cybersecurity defense, but maybe even cybersecurity offense. So if you could basically have a artificial general intelligence that's really good, you multiply it many times or copy it, and then you let it do cybersecurity offense or defense, you could have an advantage over your peers. That in my view, would be extremely destabilizing. And that's your nightmare scenario, right? Yeah. Right.
Absolutely. And thank you for this question. But I think without a doubt, it would be prudent for Europe to catch up and ramp up the production, of microchips. But there is, as Robert said, there's much more to it. But also, and this is where the problem is, it is a bit, yes, it's important to catch up. One cannot lag behind China, for example, and Russia in the production of those new technologies. On the other hand, we're racing. We are ending up in this arms race situation, which we all know does not lead to anything good. And also because the communication channels are really broken at the moment. And in fact, and I was actually thinking about it to also kind of go back to the question how safe we are. And I was thinking about it because Ben mentioned that we shouldn't call it Cold War II. And actually I was thinking, ever since your comment, that in some ways, Cold War was actually safer. In a way, like I'm talking about this from the nuclear weapons perspective, because the hotlines between Moscow and Washington were working. Technology was advanced at the time, but it was nowhere near the kind of technology that we have now. Yes, there was an arms race, but both sides more or less knew what the other one was up to. And in a way, things were slower, than nowhere near as fast.
Bipolar versus multipolar.
Exactly,
Right.
absolutely. So the bipolar, to kind of go back to Kenneth Waltz, perhaps the most stable structure was bipolar. I never thought I would say that, but here we go. And now we are indeed in the multipolar world, and also where arms control agreements have eroded. The New START is expiring next February, and there are no discussions to keep that into place. So how is that going to kind of hold and control this arms race, this new arms race? Because there's nothing there yet to control the production of that technology, right? And then we end up in a security dilemma, especially now, because there's no clear communication, unclear what Russia is doing, unclear what China is doing. Both sides fear lagging behind. So on the one hand, yes, increase the production. On the other hand, what if the other side starts increasing the production? Where do we end up, right? So again, how safe are we? Well, I guess we're safe for now from nukes, dropping somewhere, or from a conventional invasion of Europe or beyond Ukraine. But there's lots of other things there that make us less safe, perhaps the least safe since the end of the Cold War. And I would even say less safe than during the Cold War. Just to kind of provide a more direct answer. And I don't think that depends on Trump, that depends on lots of other things.
This is interesting because I think if you are charitable to the current administration for a second, one of the reasons why, if you even listen to them on the campaign trail talking about Ukraine, is they were worried about it escalating. And similarly, I have similar concerns that you have about basically in a multipolar world, we experienced something like World War I, where it was in none of the imperial powers' interest to fall into it, and yet it did. And because you have sort of a cyber security or cyber attack incident, and one thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing, and all of a sudden. And so you've got both Ukraine here in this continent, and then you have a huge defense buildup that feels very much like a pre-World War I scenario in the Pacific Rim. And something random happens, and then all sides find themselves in a conflict they didn't want to be in, but now they're in. And I do worry that gray zone conflict and cyber could be a thing where just one thing leads to another, and then it gets hot, and they can't find a way to de-escalate.
Did you want to come back in?
Very quickly, maybe. I mean, just to say, I agree with all that's been said, and also think that's one of the reasons why you end up in these kind of stalemates as well, right? Because neither side wants to capitulate, except maybe Trump on some issues. Neither side wants to escalate, and so you end up kind of trapped. I agree with what Luba was saying about the stability of bipolarity. I mean, I think there's two distinct factors here that have changed, right? One is that the degrees of freedom have changed. You have multipolarity and you have these different alignments, and some of them seem more obvious than others, like the US and Europe and China and Russia, but maybe in other perspectives they don't. So it's a more complex system. It's also a much more interdependent system, right? Which is why some people talk about interpolarity rather than kind of multipolarity, because there's so many vulnerabilities. And again, that's what we saw when this was what famously, kind of in the Chancellery in Germany, that for decades, like civilian power is based on interdependence, and suddenly you get this weaponized interdependence, right? You're more vulnerable because you're tied into Russia, and so I think you're right. It's more dangerous in some respects. On the microchip question, I don't know anything about microchips or quantum computers, but I think this is a broader question about where the technology is based and where it's being produced. And I think here, maybe we're thinking in terms of sort of West versus the rest, but actually the more difficult one at the moment for European policymakers is who is the we? Is it the West or is it Europe? And this is the whole problem with kind of strategic autonomy. Like what does it mean? Is it autonomy from non-democratic states? Is it about having that ability to kind of work together as a coherent West, or is it autonomy from the US? Are we looking to create or foster this European defense technological industrial base? I mean, some countries are really keen on that, countries like France that have never particularly enjoyed being dependent on the US. Britain is less keen on that, and right, it's kind of secretly hoping that Trump will go away at some point, and then the Atlantic West will rekindle itself. And that uncertainty is really difficult to deal with when you're talking about developments that need multiple decades to invest in. And no doubt by the time we have that capability, we'll be talking about a very different kind of war in a very different kind of future, and bemoaning the fact that we invested in this capability that we no longer need. In a way, we're always fighting the last war.
Yeah. I promised I'd go to this man at the front, and then I'll go to the lady at the end of the row, and if I can bring someone else in, I will, but dependent on time. Thanks.
Thank you. So just to push back on an earlier question that was, or an earlier comment that was made about the strength of NATO. Historically, for better or for worse, the U.S. has been the powerhouse of NATO, economically, militarily. That basically, I think currently one has to beg the question whether that's the case. Currently under the existing administration, they've sort of put a hand up and said, if you want to deal with it on your continent, you can deal with it. So that sort of raises a question about sort of what protection, if you will, does Europe have within NATO? And then secondly, the ability for Putin to basically outwit and outplay Trump in the Ukrainian war, to the extent that Trump has at least publicly sided with Putin and said to Ukraine, you've got to give up property, you've got to give up territory. And your security, the US isn't going to get involved in that. Europe, you're going to have to deal with that. So I question just all those factors. Doesn't really portray a strong NATO, and particularly with Europe, at least at this point, not necessarily having the economic or military resources to confront somebody like Putin. So why wouldn't Putin say, hey, nothing happened with Ukraine, why not go into Estonia or Latvia?
I think that's, if you read Putin's campaign biography of 2000, it's very interesting, and I'm told by Baltic peoples who are familiar with it from a distinctive point of view, it makes sense. He's really brought up in the Soviet Union, in Leningrad, not St. Petersburg. He regards the fall of the Soviet Union as the greatest disaster of the 20th century, which is an insult to Adolf Hitler. Saying Gorbachev is worse than Hitler. But it does, you start with that mentality. Secondly, the Moscow policy has always been to look east and to control the stands, which are landlocked and rich and big in their way. And of course, China is, you need to have security against China because they've got a bit of a Mexican border with China, bits of China. So one theory would be, and I think it's a legitimate one, that Putin wants to restore, the Soviet Union territorially, that Ukraine merely existed like Belarus and all these other. Minsk, look, I wrote a book starting in 1913 called What is Europe? It was empires. The cities existed, Kiev, Lvov, Lembach. I mean, you go to the Austro-Hungarian thing. Parts of Ukraine were Austrian. That's why Sadomasoch was born in the Austrian part of Ukraine. So you could say that he doesn't really want to conquer Poland, which was given its independence by, perhaps a bit under force, by Lenin and Stalin. He wanted satellites for security, which after 41, 42 was not unreasonable. The failure of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Molotov couldn't deliver Ribbentrop's friend, boss. So that's one possibility. The other, which in some ways is what NATO, Cold War NATO was set up, was not to constrain the Soviet Union, but to defend what wasn't West Central Europe, to defend Western Germany, not Prague. So that the question, I mean, all of our discussion has been based on territorial grounds, that Russia is a territorial power, which the alternative theory, which has a lot going for it, is its territorial ambitions are limited. The second goes back to a book published before I was born called Psychopathology in Politics. So when you read Putin's biography, you wonder what is normal to him, which might be psycho. But this comes back to Russia as a great power. Right. Now, in a funny way, this overlaps with parts of the chapter on Trump. And in a sense, Alaska, this, that, the fact that we're talking about it means that Putin has got a lot of it. And in fact, van der Leyen has lost the European Union has lost global significance, and Putin's Russia has gained it, not least in the subject of this discussion. So that I think, and this comes back into the business of, Putin's claim on unoccupied, well, Putin's rhetorical claim of make Russia great again is that Ukraine is an artificial construct.
Right, that's his argument.
You know, so in that sense, Greenland is an artificial construct. Right. So, but that's his psychology. And then the Ministry of Defense would also point out that the little bits that they haven't occupied gets in the way of incorporating Ukraine into its former position when Khrushchev was in Ukraine, this, that, and the other thing, when being Ukrainian, you know, was like being Scots or English. Put it this way, Putin was raised to think that the Ukrainians were like the Scots, like Starmer was raised to think about the Scots.
Right. I mean, can I ask a question for the group real quick?
Yeah,
Because this raises an interesting, so I think Putin's comments and writing about his nationalistic writing about what his goals are, I think are pretty well known to many people, and especially in science. Do we think that he is attempting to reconstruct something that looks like the Soviet Union with satellite states, or that he wants something that's culturally more like the old Russian Empire? And how might those be different?
Well, first of all, they're not in conflict, but reconstructing pride in Russian civilization it's only an empire to Ukrainians.
Right.
But it's easily done, and the difficulties in this and that are reinforcing it. I mean, I've done 20 surveys in Russia, and the difference between working with Russians and working with the Russian state, as a Soviet state, is quite striking. But I think, I mean, you can make a lot about Russian civilization, which of course is over Putin's head. But I think the business of the question of keeping Europe divided is in Russia's national interest. In the Monroe Doctrine transposed, he prefers a weaker Latin American neighboring states. And he's got them in Hungary. He's got them in countries inside the European Union that have a veto. So it's non-territorial. It is legal in the way the Chinese are doing legal things too.
Could I ask if Benjamin and Luba could quickly answer that? What we'd like to do is try and get the last two questions together and use that as the wind-up. So do you want to comment on?
Yeah, I wanted to comment actually on the gentleman's question as well. I would also say, just kind of even putting aside, Putin's ideology and is what he actually thinks the borders of the so-called Russian world is, sorry. But in terms of, what would stop him from, let's say, moving forward towards Poland, I think the main question I would ask is with what resources? I mean, if we look at Russian gains in Ukraine kind of over the past year, they have been actually very minimal. They are struggling for resource and for manpower. I mean, they're already enlisting North Korean soldiers there. So I think the big question here is whether he wants it or not, is perhaps less relevant than whether he can. And I don't think there is a capability of doing this. And surely there is absolutely no way nuclear weapons could help with that, So I would just say that resources-wise, it's just not possible.
Very quickly,
Also,
Benjamin, if that's
coming
okay.
quickly on the gentleman's question. Robert, your question was great, but my answer would be terrible, so I'm going to focus on this one. Yeah, so I think it's a really good point. I would just make two quick distinctions. I think one is between sort of Trump's view of a country that isn't a NATO member, and then and in terms of his willingness to kind of seek a quick peace in Ukraine versus what Trump's position would be if it was about one of the Baltics. And I think from what he's said so far, I can see why the position on Ukraine makes us think that he'll be softer on the other, but his rhetoric hasn't suggested that he's at all willing to countenance that. The other distinction I think is really important. There are two problems that Europe has when it comes to NATO, right? One is this question of credibility and whether Article 5 is worth the paper it's written on, but the other one is Trump's very obnoxious way of demanding that the Europeans step up and spend more on defence. And I think one of the issues here is that those two things are kind of linked in, like I said, Trump's kind of weird, hard bargaining sort of mindset. And so one of the reasons I think it's really hard to see why Trump is saying what he's saying on NATO is that one week he was saying, well, maybe we should give up on NATO. And then Rutte and all the European leaders say, you know what's fine, we'll spend 10% of GDP on defense. And then Trump seems happy with NATO. And so I think that's a bit of a kind of confounding variable when we're thinking about the credibility of Article 5 is this just a bargaining game with the Europeans? And is that appropriate? And I guess it's the same question you could say to Macron when he says that NATO is brain dead because of Trump, right? It's that in itself calls into question the credibility of Article 5. And a lot of European leaders said that Macron shouldn't have said that, but he wanted to say it in order to think about reform and alternatives. So I think they're just kind of two different dimensions in a way.
So there's a lady at the end of this row and then there's a gentleman at the back left-hand side. If we could get both those questions, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Just want to bring the discussion back to climate change and how much that might influence thinking. Here in the West, we see on our television screens daily what's happening in the Western world. We never hear about climate effects in Russia, and Putin is obviously able to control the media there. How much do you think that the reality on the ground, the melting of the permafrost, St. Petersburg under risk of flooding and so on, might play in Putin's thinking or in the thinking of Russian people and pressure they might put on him? Thank you.
Okay, and back left-hand side, sorry. Related to that, I'll squeeze you in with only because it's the very last event of the festival, please.
My point was that the assumption of the discussion this afternoon is very much about a stable Europe, in the sense that Europe is as it will be in the future. And I would suggest that perhaps looking at what's happening in Europe, that won't be the case. You see the rise of popular nationalism. You see large numbers of economic migration. That will change Europe. Europe will change. And therefore, this whole dynamic in terms of the way, particularly with Russia, but also the relationship with China and how that will change, because Russia and China are quite closely aligned, which during the first Cold War, that was unheard of. They were sworn enemies, ready to destroy each other at the drop of a hat. So I think that things are much more different than actually we're projecting them forward to be.
Okay. And the final question, comment with this gentleman over here.
This is related to the climate change question, but from a perspective of, is that what started the war? Because we told Putin we were going to stop using gas, which was his main lever in the world. So he went and invaded the Donbass, which has got a huge amount of rare earth metals under it, which are vital for the green energy revolution. So he's just swapped his energy dominance from gas to the green mechanisms. Is that actually true, or is that just, rubbish?
And and I'm glad that we've come to talk about the global south and migration and what climate change will actually do in that. But if you can wrap those all together in a final comment, no pressure at all. I'll maybe go to Benjamin first for that.
Sure, I assure you I can't wrap them all together neatly, so I'll just start by responding a little bit to the gentleman's question about how changed Europe will be. And my only point here is that I think you're right, and I think that the rise of populism in Europe will change things a lot. We're starting to see that here in Scotland and the UK with Reform UK. We've seen it with Brexit, and we've seen it across a lot of the continent. All I would say here is that I think there's different ways of understanding populism. So one is saying that this is building a new kind of this is a distinct kind of ideological position which is against multilateralism. It's very kind of ethno-nationalist, and you can see a lot of these elements obviously within these movements. The other thing is saying these are essentially opportunist chameleons in a political sense, right? And they know exactly how to injure governing parties. They have a very good rhetoric of elites and scary enemies and all of that, but when they come to power they're relatively kind of empty vessels. And I think what you've seen in quite a lot of places in Europe, not everywhere, right? I mean, there's some really transformative populist governments, and even on Ukraine they've shifted policy in places like Slovakia, but in a lot of places as well they tend to moderate when they come to power, and they tend to be sort of in some ways kind of co-opted into the mainstream. So I think what we're going to have is much more of a patchwork and a continuation of, I think what we've seen is a repoliticization of the 90s era, when everyone was told that they're going to be a neoliberal and they're told that they're going to be better off, and people have realized that that was nonsense. But you've still got a politics, so I don't think we're going to shift all the way over into that ethno-nationalist world. At least I hope not.
Robert?
Okay, so I think that two thoughts to wind up. I think that your point about that essentially we're stuck. We're in a place where the great powers can't escalate the war in Ukraine, and so, but they also can't just find a way out, and we're just stuck. And I think that's a fascinating issue in and of itself that we have to think through. And then just to talk about the rare earth mineral issue. There are rare earth minerals all over the world, and nation states are trying to find very quickly ways to make sure that they're securing their supply, either through friendly countries or by mining in their own countries. And so, and you're right, they're very important for weapons technologies and other technologies. And so there's this interesting sort of great power race for rare earth minerals. And you heard President Trump reference that in regard to Greenland, and you've heard people reference it. But many countries have those, so it's not just, the Russians have a number of other things that are valuable. They have titanium, a lot of it. But I think you're raising an issue which the great powers of the world are all sort of grappling with, how they get supply for rare earth minerals. And because it's of vital interest to their national security, they're going to prioritize that. And so at some future date, we'll be talking about this great race for rare earth minerals, probably here, maybe next year.
Richard.
For next year, in the foreseeable future, however long that may be, the key issues for Europe are, first, how much it will contribute to the socio and economic reconstruction of Ukraine, which is worth investing in because it is a cheap industrial agricultural power, especially if you get the landmines out of the big Soviet-style fields, and that there is a coordination role that Brussels can play. The second thing is, of course, what sort of political relationship you have with Ukraine, in addition to the military The military, I assume, will be set by an armistice agreement, which involves Putin and Trump. And if it doesn't involve Zelensky, then you have to just keep financing the proxy war indefinitely. But the political thing is, because there's either you join the EU or you don't. And the assumption of an EU member is politically, psychologically, it has the same rights as an Article 5 member of NATO. But the EU has nothing in between. This also covers Kosovo, the Balkans, Turkey in a funny way. So there is a role that Europe will still have to be playing, and the Council and the Commission and the Parliament can't duck it. And they will have already had their budget set to 2034, so it will not be as generous with cash as they would like.
Thank you. Luba, final word.
Again, no pressure. Yeah, to answer gentleman's question, I think there's a whole, I do agree, by the way, with what Robert said, that in the future wars will be fought for both rare resources and not so rare resources. But in terms of the role these kind of considerations played in Putin's invasion of Ukraine, I would say there's a whole bouquet of reasons behind his invasion that we are only beginning to unravel. And time, like my answer to that would be, it's certainly an interesting and plausible hypothesis. I haven't seen any evidence to it, but I think time will tell. Like when this is over, some years down the line, we will go back and restudy and study this again and try to disentangle the reasons behind it. There could very well be something resource motivated behind it, or gas motivated, if you like. To come to your question on climate change, certainly, I mean, this is not my area, I have to say, so this is just perhaps like based on some hunches. I would say that in terms of when it comes to the Russian people, climate change is something that is definitely, there's a matter of urgency there. And I do notice, just kind of by reading, you know, following a few things, there's a lot of talk about it, more than there was before. With regards to actually being proactive on it, when indeed the permafrost, you know, in large parts of Russia is melting, and there's a lot of evidence that we've all seen. I think you all know that the documentary I'm talking about, and the Russians know about it too. There is a climate catastrophe, and they know about it. But I would still say that the military-industrial complex, the biggest polluter of them all, is going and is growing. And if we start, sadly, and this is a tragedy, as concerned as Putin and the average Russians may be about it, this kind of military still outweighs the concerns about the climate change, because there seems to be a concern about kind of, you know, Russia versus the West ideologically as well. And I think that is, sadly, it would still overtake.
Thank you very much. Wow, I normally would try and round up the discussions this afternoon. My only observation, I did say I convened the Constitution Europe External Affairs and Culture Committee. We've talked a lot about external affairs and Europe today. I think from my own point of view, in trying to understand the motivation of Putin, I'm really concerned about what he is doing to the culture in Ukraine, which we didn't talk about. He wants to eliminate the language. They've destroyed many areas, churches, places of cultural interest to the Ukraine people, and I think that gives us a little bit of insight about his motivation and where he wants to see Ukraine in the future. I'm going to leave it there, but if you could thank the panel in the usual manner, I hope you've enjoyed your time. Enjoy the rest of your evening in Edinburgh.